Everyone loves a loud mouth until the room goes dead silent. When Kyle, an undefeated black belt, spotted a homeless man panhandling outside his strip mall dojo, he tossed a quarter at his feet and told the crowd he'd teach him a free lesson in respect. He didn't know the quiet drifter sleeping under the highway had spent 12 years as a Force Recon Marine, clearing rooms in Ramadi and training operators in close quarters combat. What happened next took exactly 6 seconds. The men at the shelter call him Preacher because he keeps to himself and never raises his voice. They don't know he spent 12 years as a Force Recon Marine, clearing rooms in Ramadi and teaching close quarters combat to operators who still send him Christmas cards. He never talks about it. That life feels like it happened to someone else. But the real question isn't whether Preacher can still fight. It's why he chose to stop, and what finally made him step back onto the mat. Because before that 6-second takedown, there were 12 years of war, 6 months under an overpass, and one decision to vanish. Marcus Reed was not always a ghost. In a different life, he was a weapon. For 12 years, he served as a Force Recon Marine, the kind of operator who went in first, when the rooms were dark and the walls ran with risk. In Ramadi, he cleared houses so dangerous that his unit called them meat lockers. He taught close quarters combat to men who still send him Christmas cards. Even though he hasn't had a forwarding address in 6 months, he was that rare Marine who could read a room, a threat, and a human body with the same cold precision. But when he came home, the war followed him. It lurked in the back of every grocery store, in every crowded bus, in every door that slammed too loud. For years, Marcus tried to be normal. He worked security jobs, kept his head down, and locked the past in a dark corner of his mind. But the nightmares didn't stop. The hypervigilance didn't fade. He lost jobs because supervisors thought he was too quiet, too intense, too likely to snap. His marriage fell apart not from anger, but from absence. The man his wife loved never really came home. The divorce took the house, the savings, and most of his reason to keep trying. 6 months ago, after a landlord cornered him in a narrow hallway, Marcus realized he was 1 second away from doing something irreversible. So he walked away. He didn't tell anyone. He just packed a rucksack and disappeared into the concrete veins of the city. He ended up under a highway overpass, not because he wanted to die, but because he was afraid of what would happen if he stayed around people. The shelter workers called him Preacher because he never swore, never raised his voice, and sometimes read a battered copy of Meditations under the fluorescent lights. He panhandled enough to buy black coffee and a sandwich. He never asked for more. And he never, ever talked about what he had done in the desert. But here's the thing about veterans like Marcus. The training does not leave. It lives in the muscle, in the spine, in the reptile brain that never stops scanning for exits. He had tried to bury it under silence and routine. But some mornings when a car backfired, his hands would curl into fists before his mind caught up. Some nights, when drunk men wandered too close to his tarp, he would wake with a plan already forming. Where to move, how to neutralize the threat, how to vanish again. Marcus was a weapon in storage, waiting for a reason to be unlocked. Inside his rucksack, wrapped in an old t-shirt, was a bronze star with a combat V. He didn't wear it. He didn't even look at it. But it was there. A small piece of metal that proved he had once been very, very good at the kind of violence that civilized men pretend does not exist. In 2006, he had cleared a building in Ramadi with a broken wrist and a dead radio, dragging a wounded corpsman down a stairwell while firing one-handed. He never told that story. There was no one left to tell. Across town, Kyle DeMarco was building an empire on the opposite principle. To Kyle, respect was not earned, it was demanded. At 29, he was the undefeated regional grappling champion, a Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt, and the owner of DeMarco Combat Club, a strip mall dojo with neon signage and floor-to-ceiling mirrors. He was handsome, charismatic, and utterly convinced that people were either predators or prey. His students paid a premium to learn how to dominate, not just defend themselves. Kyle's classes were less about technique and more about theater. He would swagger across the mat in a crisp white gi, bark orders, and force beginners to call him sir. He loved an audience. His favorite trick was to pick the smallest beginner, drag them to the center of the mat, and throw them hard enough to knock the wind out of their lungs. Then he would stand over them and say, "Pain is just weakness leaving the body." The room would go quiet, and that silence felt like applause to Kyle. But Kyle had a problem. No one in the outdoor strip mall paid him enough attention. The dojo's windows faced the parking lot, and Kyle had developed a habit of scanning the street for people to perform to. He especially hated the homeless man who sometimes stood near the bus stop, the quiet one with the rucksack who never flinched when Kyle's sports car roared past. To a narcissist like Kyle, that refusal to look up felt like an insult. The man was invisible, but his indifference was disrespect. Kyle started mentioning him to his students. "Look at that loser outside," he would say, pointing through the window. "That's what happens when you don't train. You end up begging for quarters." The students would laugh awkwardly. Some of them avoided eye contact with the street. But Marcus never looked up. He had stopped looking up a long time ago. The day it happened was a Tuesday in late October. The air had a cold, damp edge that made people pull their jackets tighter. Marcus was outside the strip mall, standing near a lamppost, holding a cracked cardboard sign that read simply, "Veteran. Anything helps." His rucksack was propped against the wall. He had not slept well the night before. The cold had seeped through his sleeping bag, and his back ached from years of parachute landings. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was just trying to survive until morning. Inside the dojo, Kyle's class was winding down. The students were dripping sweat on the blue mats, and Kyle was holding court near the front desk. He had a new crop of white belts, eager to impress. He glanced out the window and saw Marcus standing there, still as a statue. Something malicious flickered in Kyle's chest. He wanted to show his students what real dominance looked like. He wanted to remind them that he was the alpha, and that weakness deserved contempt. "I'll be right back," Kyle said, grabbing his jacket. He stepped outside, a quarter in his palm. Kyle strutted out in his crisp gi, black belt immaculate, the quarter already warm in his fingers. He stopped a few feet from Marcus and looked around the parking lot, making sure his students were watching through the glass. Then he flipped the quarter through the air. It landed with a metallic click on the pavement near Marcus's boots. "Get a job, loser," Kyle sneered, loud enough for the gym to hear. "Or better yet, step inside. I'll give you a free lesson in respect." The students inside pressed their faces to the window. The air went still. Marcus looked down at the quarter. Then he looked up at Kyle's smirk, and something deep inside him, something that had been locked in a vault for 6 months, 6 years, 12 years, cracked open. He should have walked away. He knew exactly what he was and exactly what this man was not. But the smirk did it. The casual cruelty of a man who had never once had to fight for his life, mocking a man who had spent 12 years doing nothing else. Marcus rose slowly, joints popping. He didn't say a word. He pulled his rucksack onto his shoulder and walked past Kyle, straight through the double glass doors of DeMarco Combat Club. The gym smelled of sweat and disinfectant. Kyle stood on the mat, arms crossed, playing to his audience. He told everyone the bum was going to learn what real discipline looked like. Then he lunged. The problem with Kyle's takedown was that it started from too far away. He dipped his shoulder, reached for Marcus's hips, and broadcast the move like a fire alarm. Marcus didn't block it. He stepped off the center line, caught Kyle's wrist, and used the momentum to guide him to the mat. Kyle tried to roll, but Marcus's knee was already on his back, his forearm across the jaw, the carotid compressed just enough to turn the world gray. Kyle slapped the mat 3 times. Tap, 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 6 seconds. The gym went so quiet you could hear the air conditioning kick on. A dozen students stood frozen, some with their phones half raised, none of them sure what they had just seen. The undefeated black belt was face down on his own canvas, gasping, one cheek pressed into the vinyl, his immaculate white gi twisted around his shoulders. Marcus released him and stepped back. He didn't gloat. He didn't even breathe hard. He just adjusted the strap of his rucksack and turned toward the door. That was when Kyle found his voice. His throat was raw, but the rage pushed through. That was assault. He screamed, scrambling to his feet. "Somebody call the cops. This bum just attacked me." The words bounced off the mirrors, ringing through the room. A few students took a cautious step backward, but several others were already replaying the moment in their heads, and the story did not match what they had witnessed. One young woman near the front desk spoke up, her voice shaking. "You lunged at him, Kyle. You invited him in. We all saw it." Her words landed like a stone in still water. Kyle turned on her, face purple. "Shut up. You don't know what you're talking about." But the crack in his authority had started, and once a thing like that starts, it does not stop. An assistant instructor, a wiry 24-year-old named Danny, was already on the phone with 911. The dispatcher asked if anyone was injured. Danny looked at Marcus, who was standing near the door, hands at his sides, completely calm. "No one's hurt. But there was a fight. My boss wants the guy arrested." Marcus said nothing. He didn't run, he just stood there, as if waiting for a bus. When the police arrived, two officers stepped through the double glass doors and took in the scene. Kyle immediately launched into a performance, gesturing at Marcus, claiming the homeless man had gone crazy on the mat. The officers were polite, but skeptical. They asked to see the security footage. The front desk clerk, a nervous girl named Tam, pulled it up on the monitor. The video rewound to the moment outside the building. It showed Kyle flipping a quarter. It showed Marcus walking inside. It showed Kyle standing on the mat with his arms crossed. And it showed Kyle lunging first. The officer looked at Kyle. "You invited him in and threw the first move. That's not assault, sir. That's self-defense." Kyle sputtered. "You don't understand who I am. I'm the owner here. I'm a professional fighter. I could have him banned from every gym in the city." The officer turned to Marcus. "You okay, sir? Any injuries?" Marcus shook his head. "No, sir. I just want to leave." The officer asked for his ID. Marcus reached into his rucksack and handed over a military veteran identification card. The officer looked at it, then at the man. Marcus Reed. That name meant nothing to the officer, but it would mean everything to a very specific group of people within the next 24 hours. Tam had already sent the security clip to a friend. That friend posted it online. By the time Marcus walked out of the police station that night, the video had 100,000 views. By the following morning, it was at 4 million. The headline wrote itself. "Homeless veteran destroys arrogant black belt in 6 seconds." The comments were vicious. Some celebrated Kyle's humiliation. Others wanted to know who the quiet man in the rucksack was. Very few guessed the truth. Then a retired gunnery sergeant named Frank Bell saw the video while scrolling in his garage. Frank had served with 3rd Battalion in Fallujah. He had been on a rooftop in 2006 when a young corporal named Marcus Reed dragged a wounded corpsman across a street under heavy fire. Frank had watched that man take a piece of shrapnel in the ribs and keep moving. For 12 years, Frank had wondered what happened to him. Now he saw him again, still alive, still moving, standing in a strip mall dojo with a rucksack on his shoulder. Frank left a comment that would change everything. "That's not just a homeless vet. That's Marcus Reed. He saved my squad leader in Ramadi. Bronze Star with valor. I'd know that face anywhere." That single comment detonated like a grenade. Reporters began calling the police department, the military archives, the shelter where Marcus sometimes slept. They dug up records that had long been sealed in military databases. Marcus Reed, Force Recon Marine, 12 years of service, 3 combat deployments, Bronze Star with Combat V, Navy Commendation Medal, honorably discharged. The man Kyle called a loser had once cleared buildings in the most violent city in Iraq. The man Kyle tossed a quarter at had once held a dying friend in his arms and refused to let go. The man sleeping under the overpass was not a failure. He was a casualty of the war that never ended. The shelter workers were stunned. They had known Marcus only as preacher, the quiet man who swept the floor without being asked and never spoke above a murmur. One volunteer told a local news crew, I always thought he was hiding from something. I never imagined it was all this. But Marcus did not want the attention. He did not speak to reporters. He packed his rucksack and left the overpass the night the story broke, moving to a different part of the city, trying to disappear again. But the damage to Kyle DeMarco was already done. His gym began to empty in real time. Students who had once paid for his approval now demanded refunds. The ones who stayed did so only to film the spot where their instructor had been humiliated. Kyle's sponsors started calling, politely at first, then with a firmer tone. The brand deals evaporated. The tournament invitations were rescinded. The man who had built his kingdom on the belief that respect was taken, not earned, was watching his empire collapse under the weight of a single 6-second video. And that was when Kyle made his second mistake. He decided he could not accept the narrative that was forming. He could not be the villain. So he began to craft a counter-story. He told anyone who would listen that Marcus had not been defending himself, but that he had been lying in wait, a trained killer who had used his military skills to ambush an innocent black belt. He filed a civil lawsuit claiming emotional distress and damage to his reputation. He demanded that Marcus be arrested for carrying a concealed weapon. There was no weapon, but the accusation was enough to send the internet into a new frenzy. The legal threats were the opening move in a much darker game, one that would force Marcus out of hiding and back into a fight he had spent 6 months trying to avoid. Because Kyle did not understand what he was really doing. He was not just poking a sleeping bear. He was aiming at a man who had already survived the worst of human nature and had learned to disappear rather than explode. But even the most disciplined men have a breaking point, and Kyle DeMarco was about to find out exactly where Marcus Reeds was. The lawsuit was filed on a Thursday morning. Kyle's attorney, a man named Richard Cole, called a press conference outside the dojo and announced that Marcus Reed had ambushed his client, using military training to inflict a concussion and lasting emotional trauma. He demanded $200,000 in damages and a formal apology. The story raced through local news, then national, then across the world. Comment sections erupted. Some people believed Kyle, pointing to the fact that Marcus had been a trained killer. Others pointed to the video, the quarter, the lunge. But the attention was exactly what Kyle wanted. Once again, he was the center of the story. Marcus, meanwhile, had vanished. He had left the overpass and was sleeping behind a church on the east side of town, wrapped in a tarp and a sleeping bag. He didn't own a phone. He didn't check the news. He had no idea that his face was on every screen in the country. He only knew that the nights were getting colder and that there were more eyes on the street looking for him. But the brief safety he had felt in anonymity was gone. Then a lawyer named Rachel Okafor found him. Rachel was a former Army judge advocate, now in private practice, specializing in veterans' rights. She had seen the video, read Frank Bell's comment, and spent 3 days searching the city's shelters and food banks. When she finally located Marcus, he was sitting on the steps of a church, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. She introduced herself, said she would represent him for free, and told him something that made him look up for the first time in days. Kyle DeMarco was not just a bully, he was a repeat offender. Rachel had spent the weekend digging through court records, police reports, and insurance filings. What she found was a pattern that stretched back 5 years. Before opening his own gym, Kyle had been an assistant instructor at a larger martial arts academy. He had been fired after 3 separate students reported injuries that required medical attention. One of them was a 15-year-old boy whose arm was broken during a demonstration throw. The gym settled with the family out of court. The records were sealed, but Rachel had a source inside the courthouse. But that was only the beginning. There were complaints from 7 different parents at DeMarco Combat Club, all within the last 2 years. They had withdrawn their children after Kyle had thrown them too hard, or held a submission too long, or mocked them until they cried. The gym had no written safety policies. The waivers Kyle made students sign were designed to protect him, not them. The insurance company was already investigating after a claim was filed by a mother whose son suffered a concussion during a training exercise. The wait, It gets worse moment came when Rachel tracked down a former student named Daniel Ortiz. Daniel had started training with Kyle at age 13. He was now 17, and he had a story to tell. In a recorded deposition, Daniel described how Kyle had used him as a training dummy for weeks, throwing him to the mat so hard that his back still ached. One afternoon, after Daniel failed to execute a move, Kyle applied a chokehold and held it until Daniel lost consciousness. Daniel woke up on the mat, gasping, with Kyle standing over him, laughing. "I thought I was going to die," Daniel said. He kept saying he was teaching respect, but all he taught me was fear. Daniel's mother had tried to file a police report, but Kyle's lawyer had threatened to sue for defamation. The family couldn't afford a fight, so they dropped it. Until now. Rachel filed a motion to dismiss Kyle's civil suit, citing unclean hands and malicious prosecution. Then she did something even more effective. She submitted the security footage from the gym, not just the 6-second clip, but the full recording from the days leading up to the incident. It showed Kyle taunting Marcus through the window on at least 4 separate occasions. It showed him throwing a quarter at another homeless man 2 weeks earlier. It showed him telling students that homeless people were parasites and failures. The judge overseeing the case, a former military police officer, reviewed the evidence and issued a stunning ruling. She not only dismissed Kyle's lawsuit, she referred Kyle's conduct to the state licensing board and ordered a formal investigation into DeMarco Combat Club. The gym's insurance company immediately suspended coverage, forcing Kyle to close his doors. Within a week, his landlord filed eviction papers. The empire Kyle had built was not just crumbling, it was being bulldozed. But the story didn't end there. A former member of Kyle's own family stepped forward. His estranged brother, Kevin DeMarco, gave an interview in which he described a childhood of manipulation and violence. "Kyle has always needed to be the biggest man in the room," Kevin said. "When we were kids, he would hurt me and then tell our parents I fell. He's never faced a consequence in his life." The interview was devastating. It humanized Kyle in a way no one expected, but it also confirmed the pattern. Kyle wasn't just arrogant, he was deeply broken, and he had been hurting people his entire life. Meanwhile, Marcus was receiving an outpouring of support. A GoFundMe page set up by Frank Bell raised over $80,000 in 1 week. The money was placed in a trust managed by a veterans organization. A local landlord offered Marcus a furnished apartment at no cost for 6 months. The VA reached out to offer counseling and job training. Even the Marine Corps sent a letter thanking him for his service and inviting him to a reunion. Marcus, for his part, was overwhelmed. He had spent 6 months convinced that the world had forgotten him. Now the world was demanding to know his story. He gave only one interview, a short statement recorded by Rachel. He didn't talk about the fight. He didn't gloat. He simply said, "I didn't want to hurt anyone. I just wanted to be left alone." But when someone attacks, you have to defend yourself. That's all there is. His words, clipped and quiet, did more damage to Kyle's reputation than any rant could have. The public saw a man who had endured unspeakable hardship and remained humble. The contrast could not have been more stark. But Kyle was not finished. Facing ruin, he did the only thing left to him. He challenged Marcus again, this time publicly. He posted a video on social media claiming that the takedown was a lucky move, that he had slipped, that Marcus had cheated. He demanded a rematch, no rules, no time limit, in a cage, with all proceeds going to charity. He framed it as a chance to prove who the real fighter was. The internet exploded. Fight promoters called. A major streaming platform offered a 6-figure payday, and for one terrible moment, it looked like the entire saga would be dragged back into the ring. But Marcus declined. Through Rachel, he released a statement, "I don't fight for sport. I don't fight for money. And I don't need to prove anything to anyone, least of all a man who hurts children." The refusal was more powerful than any victory. It stripped Kyle of the one thing he still wanted, a chance to reclaim his image. Without a rematch, there was only the original video, playing on a loop, forever showing Kyle lunging at a homeless man and ending up face down on the mat. Then came the final revelation, the one that would end it all. A retired martial arts master named Sensei Robert Yamamoto, who had trained Kyle as a teenager, released a public letter. In it, he wrote, "I have watched Kyle DeMarco's descent with great sorrow. The boy I once taught had promise, but promise without humility is poison. I have seen the videos. I have read the reports. I can no longer associate my name with this man. Therefore, I am revoking his rank. His black belt is hereby null and void." It was the ultimate sanction. Kyle had lost his gym, his students, his sponsors, his lawsuit, and now his belt. He was a black belt in name only. But even as the world celebrated Marcus Reed, one question remained unanswered. Why had a decorated war hero ended up sleeping under a highway overpass? The answer, when it finally came out, would change the story again. Because Marcus had not just walked away from his life. He had been reported missing by his unit, and the person who had filed that missing persons report was the same man he had saved in Ramadi. The same man who had been searching for him for 2 years. And that man was about to walk back into Marcus's life with a secret that would force one last confrontation. One that had nothing to do with fighting and everything to do with forgiveness. The man who had filed the missing persons report was named Nathan Brooks. He had been the corpsman Marcus dragged down that stairwell in Ramadi, one hand firing, the other locked around Nathan's collar. For 2 years, Nathan had been searching for Marcus, following every lead, posting in veteran forums, even hiring private investigators. When he saw the video, he drove 16 hours straight to the city. Now he stood on the steps of the old church, a manila folder in his hand. Marcus was sitting where Rachel had found him, sipping black coffee from a paper cup. He looked up and saw a face he had never expected to see again. Older, broader, with a firefighter's build and a wedding ring. Nathan said his name, and something in the sound of it cracked the walls Marcus had spent 6 months building. They didn't hug, they just stood there. 2 men from a world most people never see, staring at each other in the fading light. Nathan handed him the folder. Inside was a missing persons report, a photo of 2 little boys in front of a Christmas tree, and a secret that had been buried for over a decade. Nathan pointed to the photo. "My sons," he said, "they exist because of you." Marcus's hands began to shake. Then Nathan told him what he had driven all night to say. After Marcus had dragged him down that stairwell, Nathan had been airlifted to a hospital in Germany. He was unconscious for weeks. When he finally woke, he asked for Marcus. The nurses told him Marcus had been treated and shipped back to the States. What they didn't tell him was that Marcus had been told Nathan died on the operating table. A clerical error, a miscommunication in the chaos of war. Marcus had carried that false grief for years, believing he had failed to save his friend. Nathan only learned the truth a year after Marcus disappeared, when he finally obtained his own medical records. He realized then that Marcus had been living under a weight that didn't need to be carried. He tried to find him, but Marcus had vanished. So Nathan filed the missing persons report and never stopped looking. "It wasn't your fault, Marcus," Nathan said. "You didn't fail me. You saved me. Now you have to save yourself." The words hung in the cold air. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He looked at the photo again, then at Nathan's face. A single tear traced a path through the grime on his cheek. For the first time in 6 months, he allowed himself to believe that maybe he deserved to be found. In the weeks that followed, Marcus began the slow work of rebuilding. He accepted the apartment offered by the local landlord. He started therapy at the VA, not because he wanted to, but because Nathan and Rachel both refused to leave him alone until he went. He reconnected with his unit, attending a small reunion organized by Frank Bell. They didn't talk about the fight. They talked about Ramadi, about the ones who didn't come home, about the strange road back to life. Marcus discovered he wasn't the only one who had disappeared for a while. Another Marine from his platoon had spent a year living in his truck after discharge. The shared silence became a kind of brotherhood again. Kyle's fate, by contrast, was a slow descent into irrelevance. After the Black Belt revocation, his remaining students vanished. The state licensing board revoked his instructor certification. His insurance company sued him for fraud. An investigative report revealed he had been teaching without proper safety credentials for years. The district attorney announced charges of assault on a minor, based on the testimony of Daniel Ortiz and 7 other former students. Kyle initially fought, hiring a new lawyer, but the evidence was overwhelming. In a plea deal, he pleaded guilty to 3 counts of misdemeanor assault, received 2 years of probation, and was banned from teaching martial arts in the state. The gym was sold at auction to a woman named Dana Cho, a former Olympic judo alternate who turned the space into a community center for at-risk youth. She named it Second Chance Dojo. On the wall, in small letters, she painted the words, "Respect is earned, not given." Marcus visited the dojo once months after it opened. He stood outside the glass doors, where he had once stood with a cardboard sign. Dana recognized him from the video and invited him in. He walked onto the mats, but he didn't fight. He sat on the bleachers and watched a class of 12-year-olds practicing breakfalls. Some of them giggled. None of them cried. After class, a skinny kid named Eli walked up to him and said, "My mom showed me your video. Are you really a hero?" Marcus looked at the boy, then at the mat where he had taken Kyle down in 6 seconds. "No," he said quietly. "I'm just a guy who learned to stand still long enough to see the truth." The boy seemed to understand. The final surprising detail came when Marcus moved into his new apartment. While unpacking a box of donated clothes, he found the quarter. It had been tucked into the side pocket of his rucksack, the same quarter Kyle had flipped at his feet. He had picked it up without thinking, a habit from months of collecting change. He turned it over in his fingers now. 25 cents. That was all it had cost to change everything. He didn't throw it away. He placed it on the windowsill, a small reminder that sometimes the smallest acts of cruelty can unlock the greatest acts of courage. Then he opened the folder Nathan had given him and pulled out the photo of Nathan's 2 boys. He taped it to the wall beside the quarter. That was his new mission, not fighting, but remembering that there were people worth coming home to. As the months passed, Marcus began volunteering at a local shelter, the same one where he had once slept. He never spoke about the video. He didn't have to. The men there knew who he was, and they treated him with a quiet reverence. But Marcus would sit with them, share his coffee, and sometimes read from meditations. One night, a young homeless veteran asked him how he had survived. Marcus thought about it for a long time. "I stopped trying to survive alone," he said. "That's the only way out." That answer, more than anything else, sealed the lesson of the whole saga. Marcus Reed had not been saved by a punch. He had been saved by a friend who refused to stop looking for him, by a lawyer who believed in justice, and by a nation that finally saw the true cost of war. And Kyle DeMarco had not been destroyed by a takedown. He had been destroyed by the truth he had spent his whole life running from. That respect cannot be demanded, only given. Now, as the story continued to ripple through the world, millions of people were left asking the same question. Not whether a homeless veteran could still fight, but why we allow the people who fought for us to slip through the cracks in the first place. And for one man, that question was no longer just a headline. It was a life, a second chance, and a quarter sitting on a windowsill, glinting in the morning light. The story of Marcus Reed and Kyle DeMarco spread far beyond a single strip mall. It became a conversation about who we choose to see and who we choose to ignore. Every day, men and women like Marcus stand outside grocery stores, sleep under bridges, and carry entire wars inside them. They do not ask to be noticed. Sometimes they are overlooked until a quarter hits the pavement and a smartphone video changes everything. But the lesson here goes deeper than a 6-second takedown. Kyle DeMarco did not lose because he was weak. He lost because he had built his entire identity on the belief that dominance is strength. Marcus Reed won the moment he refused to be goaded. And he won again when he declined a rematch. Real power is not loud. It is patient. It walks away. It only acts when no other choice remains. The question that lingers is not whether a homeless Marine can still fight. It is why a decorated combat veteran had to sleep beneath a highway at all. The systems meant to catch men like Marcus too often let them slip through. And the same society that cheers a viral knockout is often the one that turns its back on the quiet person holding a cardboard sign. If this story means anything, it is that we should look twice at the people we pass. Some of them are not broken. They are just waiting for a reason to stand up. What Kyle never understood is that respect cannot be demanded, and humiliation cannot be undone by a lawsuit. The quarter he flipped that day did not belong to Marcus. It belonged to the moment, and the moment chose its champion. So now we want to hear from you. Have you ever witnessed someone's arrogance backfire this spectacularly? Have you ever met a quiet person whose strength surprised everyone? Tell us in the comments below. If this story reminded you that true strength is often silent, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to this channel for more real-life drama that proves the most dangerous person in the room is usually the one trying hardest to avoid a fight. Thanks for watching. We will see you in the next one.